Pinpoint Asia podcast. Today, we have a special guest with us. We've been hearing about AI and how it's going to take over the world and all that, right? So today on the podcast, we're honored to have Kevin Pereira, the MD for Blue Limited, which is a consulting firm that specializes in artificial intelligence. He is also a guest lecturer at HKUST and teaches big data in finance and AI in marketing to MBAs and MFin students. We're going to ask him a bunch of questions today pertaining to AI to learn more about this topic. So without ado, let's welcome Kevin Pereira to the Pinpoint Asia podcast. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Not at all, Vince. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate being here.
So let's start off with my first question, right? Your background. So let's start off. How did you get into this AI space? And can you tell us a bit about your background, please?
Yeah, sure. So I was born and raised in Hong Kong. So similar to you, Vince, I know you spent a bunch of time here. And then I actually went to undergrad and studied business there, right? So I started my career in finance many, many years ago. I was a private banker with Citi in New York for a while. I really enjoyed the job, but I think at some point I wanted to try something a little bit different. So wanted to make that sort of jump into technology. And I meet a lot of people these days who want to also make that similar jump from finance into tech as well. And I think for me, the most efficient way to do that was actually going to MBA school. So I went over to INSEAD for about a year, really enjoyed it, and then used that as a pivot to transition into technology. So my first job post at INSEAD, it was actually working in Myanmar, where I was doing internet infrastructure, so helping to build that out. So things like data centers, fiber optic in the ground, cell towers. We were building all of that stuff back in 2015, 2016 over in Myanmar. So for me, it was a great opportunity to work in a frontier market, number one, and then also to understand the impact of technology on people's lives. Because when you work in a frontier market and then all of a sudden they go from having, let's say, nothing in terms of tech to like a cell phone, that really changes a lot of things that they do, ways that they see information, and also just sort of business models ultimately that they work in, right? And I thought that was really powerful. I think Myanmar was a tough place to live, but I enjoyed the tech aspect of it. So I ended up coming back to Hong Kong. And when I was here, an alumni from my school was just about to set up his AI consulting firm. So I ended up joining him, and kind of the rest is sort of history. If I maybe elaborate a bit more on Blue Artificial Intelligence. So what we do is we do AI consulting and AI education as well. And I think at the beginning, we very much found that people are either scared of AI or confused by it. And I think the sort of lesson for us from that was that it's important to concentrate on education as well, right, in addition to just doing the consulting. So what we now find is that there's quite a bit of demand for education, both from corporates and then also from academia and universities as well, as you so generously mentioned before. And then we also have the consulting piece there. So that's kind of the background a bit on myself, and then also what Blue Artificial Intelligence does as well.
I'm going to ask you one question, right? So why an MBA to get into tech? So usually people think that you'd have to do some sort of a degree in tech or do a programming course or something, right? Why did you think of doing an MBA to get into technology?
Yeah, so, I think in my case, I very quickly realized that if I try to compete with programmers who've been doing that since they were 8, there's no way I'm going to catch up. But I do think with technology, you need a business component there to help monetize it, to help think about what is the right technology to build. And I think that requires someone who understands technology enough to be dangerous, but also understands business well as well, right? And I think going forward, even in the AI space, I think we're going to see a lot more of newer roles pop up that require people to have a business sense and to also understand the tech as well. I think different firms call it different stuff, but I've seen McKinsey call it a business translator type of roles. And I do think that going forward, we are going to see a much higher demand for that stuff. So, I realized, A, I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to compete with them. But B, I also felt like there was a hole there between sort of the business side and the tech side. And I think for someone with my background, that was probably the right place to go and fill. So that was really my sort of thinking behind kind of going for the MBA, but then also focusing a little bit on the tech side. And in addition to that, I think the MBA was great to look at soft skills as well, because I think the soft skill piece is something else that I think in the tech space at the time was, a little bit kind of in shorter supply, if you like. Because, if you're going to sell a piece of technology, I don't think you can just go to a client and say, hey, look, this is why my product is so amazing. You got to build a relationship. You've got to do a bunch of software things to enable that to happen as well. So I think the MBA kind of set me up, I think, for those skills as well. So I try to take a bunch of the soft skill classes. And as a private banker, I also saw the value of the soft skill piece too. So that was kind of my thinking for why an MBA would help in tech, but also help with skills that I think would be related to that job in the future as well.
Before we start talking about AI, right, you have to give us a story or two about Myanmar. What was the experience like? What do you remember most about your time there?
Oh, it was fantastic. I think for me, the biggest takeaway from Myanmar was just being, I would say, or taking things for granted in Hong Kong. So for example, we're talking on this call right now. I'm sitting in a room with air conditioning, electricity, and these are things you don't have to worry about, right? In a sort of market like Hong Kong. Whereas I think if you go to Myanmar, because it's such a frontier market and infrastructure, at least at the time, was very, very kind of rudimentary. You really became thankful for a hot shower, just air conditioning in general. And to me, that opened my eyes in terms of what we take for granted on the personal side. I'd say also on the business side, right? If you think again about a developed market, you often tend to see where let's take getting paid as an example, right? The CFO kind of does everything, pushes a button, and then it all happens. Whereas when I was in Myanmar, it was a very cash-based economy. So when we paid people, you'd basically have a lot of cash like floating around, and then you'd basically hand out envelopes. Right? It sounds like it was something of a mobster or sort of gangster kind of movie, but that's just how it happens because people in Myanmar don't have bank accounts, right? So I think for me, it was just many things I took for granted, both on the personal side and also on the business side as well. And then I think when you go to a place like Myanmar, you start to truly appreciate when you do come back, like how efficient processes are, how well oiled systems kind of work. And I think you need to go outside to a place where that's not there to truly appreciate what you have with it.
Before this whole chat GPT stuff, right, you were already talking about AI. Yeah. So, I mean, how did you have the foresight to think that, look, AI is going to be the next big thing? Yeah, before the whole chat GPT and all that, all the hoopla around it.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, if I think about maybe to make a distinction here, right? So I think sort of pre a lot of this generative AI stuff, right? A lot of what we would call maybe, I'm going to use the phrase older AI, but it's not really old because it's only been like 5 or 6 years, right? But a lot of older AI tends to focus on content or data that already exists and then does analysis on it, right? And I think that's actually very useful overall, right? And that's still being done today. I think with ChatGPT, what happened is it really led to the rise of a category of AI called generative AI. And the difference between the sort of traditional AI space and then the generative AI part is that the Gen AI primarily is involved in creating content. Okay, so I think when it comes to thinking about the business value of AI, it's really more about considering it as a tool to achieve an objective, right? And the difference with kind of ChatGPT is it's a different tool. So I think in my case, I was always very interested in AI and technology's ability to change business models. Right? And I think that's fundamentally true both of the traditional AI that we had before, and then also the generative AI as well. So I just think with Gen AI, because it's so easy to use for people, that's why I think in the public perception or the public perception of it is become so much bigger because it's not something that a few people in an ivory tower could use, but it's you, me, and grandma overnight can start to use ChatGPT. But I think the business model transformation power that technology and AI has actually been around for a really long time. And for me, that's really the interesting part. So when we do the consulting, we talk to companies and people about how is your business model going to change, and then can AI and technology help with that, right? And that's the bit that excites me. And so whether the tool changes or not, it's fine. Maybe it helps with more changes, but I think the ethos is there business model transformation, and can that be enabled with AI? And that's the exciting part for me.
On that note, right, could you define AI for us? Because some of the times I'm thinking, right, look, I mean, you have predictive analytics, and then you've got like people essentially analyzing data, and then they come up with the next decision based on they essentially what's the word? They project the data onto what might happen in the future, right?
Yep. Mhm.
What's the difference between that and AI? What's the definition of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so for me, right, I actually even go back to a more fundamental view of that. And then when I'm talking to clients and students, I define AI as simply a tool to achieve an objective. And why I like that type of definition is it forces you as the user to think about what is the objective. Right? And I think that's important because I see a lot of companies nowadays go out and buy some really cool AI technology and then force it into a use case. And that's a horrible idea. I think the right way to think about this is what is our business problem? What are we trying to solve? And then is this AI piece that we're going to go out and buy, Is it going to help us with it? And I think to do that, you need to firmly think about what your objective is. And if you do that right, then actually your choice of what AI you buy, the choice of what data you use, the choice of what process you ultimately use actually becomes very simple. And I think that's really the right way to do it rather than thinking about, hey, what is this specific AI and where's it going? I just think make it simple, right? It's a tool to achieve an objective. What's our fundamental objective we have? And then is AI the right tool? And as the AI guy, I can say that sometimes AI is the right tool and sometimes it's also not as well, right? And we can definitely talk about that in our conversation here. But fundamentally, as a definition, I think if you go with AI as a tool to achieve an objective, it forces you to think about the objective and it also makes it a lot less scary because it's a tool that you can control.
We can talk about that now, actually. So when is it a good tool and when is it not a good tool, as an example, with a practical example?
Sure. So I can talk about this for hours, right? But let me, rather than putting an example, let me provide a framework for people and companies to think. Because if I give an example, it might be constrained to one industry. But I think a framework is a better way for the larger kind of thought process. And so if I think about when is there a situation where this becomes a big question, right? I think in our region of the world, so, and I'm stereotyping a bit, but let's just take Asia, right? If you look at the unit cost of labor in Asia compared to, let's say, North America or Europe, you'll find that the unit cost of labor in Asia tends to be lower, right? So when companies are thinking about, do I use AI or do I just hire 5 more people? If it's in a place where the labor cost is high, then the case for AI becomes stronger, right? Because that number is going to be a bit closer, right? So therefore, one of the ways to think about it is cost. And I think in a place with high labor costs, that is a more difficult decision because the numbers are closer. Whereas in a place like Asia, sometimes the labor cost is so low relative to building a new AI model, going through the whole process, that it might actually it might be more economical to just hire, let's say, 5 people and then do it without the AI piece there too. Right. So I think one of the frameworks or one of the inputs into the framework is definitely cost for sure. I think that's a big one. I think another framework or another kind of input into the framework should also be, again, which industry are you in? Because I do think for some industries, you need more domain expertise, right? So if, for example, we're talking about AI in healthcare, right? I think it's really important to have a doctor or a medical professional on the team that's building the AI, right? Because in those specific areas, if you don't have domain expertise, then building the AI actually becomes quite complicated because you don't know the industry, you don't know the nuances, you're just putting together something you think is going to work, right? So this is a much kind of, there's many more inputs that come into this. But if companies are thinking about it, I would kind of start at the cost level to see whether or not the cost is going to enable you to make this business model transformation. And then secondly, even with the solution that you're going to use, did that company have the right domain expertise to be able to build something that's really applicable for your industry and your geography as well? I think those are 2 very important inputs into that framework for sure.
In that context, right, what does building the AI mean?
So I think the building the AI can come in a few different forms. Because if we think about some of the tools that are available to us today, some of those tools, for example, things like ChatGPT or large language models, you can almost build the model yourself, right? So let's take a very easy example. So let's say we want the large language model to write emails in your own style, right? The training for that's actually pretty simple. Take 15 or 20 emails that you have, put them into something like ChatGPT, and then say, use this as kind of your training set. And based on the patterns that you see here, write an email to my boss saying that I missed the Zoom meeting this morning, right? And what it will do is it will actually go in there, look at patterns, and then based on those patterns, write an email for you. Okay, so that would be a simple use case. You can get much more complicated things where, you might be looking at, AI that's used in, let's say, manufacturing. And then for a very specific manufacturing process, you might have the AI do the quality assurance, right? So the thing is, the use cases can vary quite considerably. So the model, the tool that you use for that objective will change drastically, right? So I think, again, based on the objective you have, you would then think about what tool you use. And that comes back to your question about what is the AI that you need to build over the model, right? And I think nowadays we're seeing very versatile tools. So things like ChatGPT can be used to write emails. Things like ChatGPT can be used to be a thought partner if you're thinking about investing in healthcare in Indonesia. So it is very wide in terms of what it can do. So again, for me, it really boils down to what is the objective you have. Based on that objective, you then think about what tool you need to use, or what model you might have to build if the existing tools cannot give you what you want.
Okay, I was going to ask you this later on, but maybe that's a good time to, you hear about AGI, right? Artificial general intelligence
Yep.
versus artificial intelligence, and how
Yep.
Elon Musk is scared about AGI or whatever, right? I mean, how
Yep.
much, what is AGI and why are some people scared of it?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about AGI, right, stands for artificial general intelligence, and sort of the rough thinking behind this, and why I say it's rough is because people also in the AI industry don't exactly agree on what AGI is, right? But what a lot of people tend to kind of converge to is that this is an AI that can mimic humans' ability to generally do a lot of tasks, right? So for a lot of people, that kind of translates into, hey, this is the AI that's equivalent to a human being. Okay. Now I think it's difficult to do that in my personal view from a definition standpoint, because if you think about humans themselves, right? Humans tend to be specialized. Like you're working in your industry, I'm working in my industry. So if tomorrow you get us to kind of fly a helicopter, like we're probably going to crash the helicopter, right? Like we're not good at doing everything. So to be able to say that AGI is like a human that can do everything, I think is a bad definition to start with, because in general humans can't do everything, right? We are specialized almost by nature, right? And so therefore, I think to make the equivalence between AGI and humans, I think is a tenuous one. But let's leave that aside. Let's leave the philosophical piece aside, and let's talk about a general purpose AI that can basically do everything. I think that's actually really hard, right? As we try to do a lot of the AI development, you tend to see for most business applications of AI, they tend to be narrow, okay? Meaning that they're really good at doing one specific thing or a group of related things very, very well, and they do them again and again and again. It's very repetitive, and that tends to be where a lot of AI is applied. Now, something like ChatGPT and large language models are a little bit different because they are starting to have conversations like we talked about before in terms of email output, but then also in terms of being a thought partner. So it's getting a bit wider. But if you ask ChatGPT tomorrow to come and play tennis with you, it's not going to be able to do that, right? So I think, in my view, we're still quite far away from AGI. But what I will also say is that when we look back at history, artificial intelligence has in the past gotten exponentially better, right? So if you asked me 3 to 5 years ago, would there be a ChatGPT? I'd probably tell you absolutely not. And I would tell you that it would come, but it might come in 10 or 15 years down the line. Right. So I think we as human beings can't really, I think, appreciate or think in an exponential way. And that's not to say that we are dumb, right? But it's just not, we think much more linear fashion, whereas development of AI is happening exponentially. So I think AGI will, it's if it comes, it'll probably come quicker than most people expect because of that exponential curve that's out there. But I think it's important to also remember that the current models that we have in terms of ChatGPT and AI, they are using a lot of computational resources. We are pushing out a lot of electricity and energy because of them in data centers right now. Whereas if you think about a human brain, it works on, relatively speaking, much less energy. And so on an energy adjusted basis, I think our brains are doing a lot of complex calculations. They're also looking at things like emotions, which are very hard to process. So I think the more I actually work in AI, the more I'm impressed and fascinated with the human brain, because I think on an energy adjusted basis to do what we do, and even if you make that comparison between us and AGI, it's an amazing amount of things that the human brain can actually do. So, for those people on the podcast who might be worried about, oh, are our brains going to be obsolete? And I think at least for a while, like we're doing some amazing stuff, and even if we compete on energy, I think we're beating the AI by a long way on an energy adjusted basis at least.
I read something like what? I mean, what is it? 20% of the brain is 20%, and it occupies it takes 20% of the energy of the body, and it's 80 something like that. I don't remember,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah. I
there's some
think in general, I think it does use up a lot of the body's energy, and it creates a bunch of heat as well. I'm not sure of the exact figures, but yeah, I think there's some sort of some numbers going on there for sure.
Yeah. Going back to the subject of how to use AI, right? I mean, the smaller companies, right? They might feel that they're missing out on this AI boom, and they might think that like, what do I do? Is this technology going to take over or whatever, right? What's a good mental model to think to use, right? When it comes to how am I going to use AI in my workflow, right? Whether I should do it and how do I increase my profits or whatever? What's a good way to think about that?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm gonna sound like a broken record by the end of the podcast, but I come back to AI is a tool to achieve an objective, right? And if I'm a business, then the way or one of the sort of frameworks to think about it is in my business process, what are pieces of the process that are painful, repetitive, error prone? Find the pain points in the process. Okay. And then once you've identified those, ask yourself the question, could AI potentially help with this part of the process? Right. I think that's the right way to look at it. Because I think if you do that, one, within an organization, it creates less fear. Because if you bring AI to do the whole thing, I think you'll run into a lot of pushback from the employees. And secondly, if you tell the folks who are there that we're going to bring in something that takes the painful part of your job out of the equation, I think you'll automatically get a lot of people on board. And again, maybe to provide a concrete example. So recently I was doing faculty training for university professors, right? Just as an example. And I asked them, like, what are some of the challenges that you guys have in the process of your daily job? And so one of them said, hey, you know what? Creating exams is difficult, right? Because I got to sit there, I got to think about assessment, I got to figure out like how I'm going to test these kids because they're quite smart. And so we need to come up with some assessment. So as just kind of a trial exercise, right? I actually put in a couple of slides from one of my courses, and I asked ChatGPT, hey, come up with 10 multiple choice questions from these slides, right? And immediately just popped them up straight away because I could see graphically what was going on. So now, in case your listeners are not familiar, there's also the ability for us to take pictures, put them into a large language model, and then ask the LLM questions about the pictures, right? Or do tasks related to those pictures. So in this case, I put up a few slides and I said, hey, come up with 5 or 10 multiple choice questions. And I think the minute we did that, the people in the room got super excited, right? And then again, it's not that it was going to replace them, but it was more like there's a really painful part of my process. And now I've just seen it done in a super efficient way that will make my life a lot easier. And I think, Vince, it wasn't that they're just going to take those 5 questions and copy paste them onto their exam, but it provides a starting point, right? Then you can go in, change the questions, change the responses. You can put your kind of human touch on that, but it does sort of 60, 70, 80% of the grunt work for you beforehand. And that I think many people find really helpful and useful.
Okay. That's fascinating, right? I mean, on that note, right? Say if someone wants to just copy and paste, you know how you can regenerate those answers anyway, right? At some point, it's going to be quite hard to say whether something is done by Chat GPT or by a human. My question is that going to be a problem or what?
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue, right? So I think it's true. So if we think about generative AI, it can actually provide output in many different forms, right? So text is one, pictures is the other, right? So even within the picture space, there's a lot of worries as to these idea of what we call deep fakes. So where we use deep learning and create fake images and videos, there's a lot of problems associated with that. So right now in Korea, high schools, there's this huge issue with like people using pictures of other students and creating sort of negative kind of content with that. So I think it is definitely a problem for sure. I think there's a big dark side to that. I think even when it comes to things like intellectual property, right? Like, did you really write that, or did we, plagiarize? I think before plagiarizing was just purely copying, right? But this is a little bit different because you can take something and you can put it into ChatGPT to train, and then you can say, hey, come up with something inspired by this, right? So I think there is 2 questions here. So one question is, does the quality improve, right? So I think that's an interesting piece. And I think the second piece here, is that the right thing to do? And I think this is the maybe more to getting to what you're saying, because if you're going to say that this is not the right thing to do, then if you're going to have a ban on AI output, you need to be able to detect it. And right now the problem is detecting AI output in terms of text is extremely difficult. I would almost say it's don't even bother, right? Because even if you were to create something today that can detect it, tomorrow the output from these large language models is going to be so much more varied that the patterns that were there today that you use to detect it won't be applicable to tomorrow. So in terms of being able to do it, Vince, I think it's really hard, right? And then the second question that follows on from that is, why would you want to detect it? And I think the biggest case for that is if you want to ban it, right? Then you have to be able to detect it. And I just think if for those companies or maybe educational institutions that want to ban it, I just think it's not going to be able to be possible going forward. So that's a huge issue, and we need to be mindful of that going forward for sure.
plagiarism aside, yeah, I mean, I saw this article about how this one guy was, doing nothing in an American job, outsourced everything to India, and just was earning a big salary or whatever, right? My question is, one way to think about it is that the guy is smart. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
essentially, he's using his time wisely, doing nothing, which is what he wants, right? And he's outsourcing everything, right? So plagiarism aside, say, you do all my work using Chat GPT, right? And nobody's able to detect it, yeah. And what's wrong with it?
So let me answer this question with my like professor hat on for a second. So if you think about like students, part of the reason they have homework assignments, part of the reason they do stuff is actually to learn, right? And I think it depends how you define learning, but let's take a very traditional method of learning and talk about memorization. Right? I personally think it's not the right way to go, but for discussion purposes, let's talk about memorization. So if you use ChatGPT to do your homework, right, and you don't have any real kind of brain exposure to the content, you won't remember any of it. So you'll hand in your essay that ChatGPT did, and then a year later, when someone asks you about Shakespeare, you're like, I remember something that ChatGPT wrote, but I never was involved in it, right? So from a learning perspective, especially on the memorization side, I think it has some issues there. Okay, so that's one aspect of it. If I continue on the learning, the other area where people might start to think about using this is in the process of learning, right? So process meaning that when you do math, for example, you can learn that 3 times 3 is 9, but there's a larger thought as to why would you use multiplication for this particular problem. Now, again, if AI just does it for you, then your ability to think about what is the right scenario to use this type of process, I think you lose that thinking ability as well. And in my view, I think with calculators and stuff, if we just stay on math, right? 3 times 3 is 9. I don't think we need to learn that anymore. But when do you multiply? When do you divide? What is your process for applying the methodology to a problem? I think that's something that experience is really important for from a learning from the learning aspect. And that's true for kids who are in university. But I think learning also happens in your career as well, right? So you're probably learning every day something new happens and becomes part of your experience set. But if you don't do any of the work, like the person you're talking about, you outsource everything. Sure, it's efficient. Sure, you get paid, and maybe you have a lot of free time where you can, sit on the beach and enjoy your life. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, right? If you really want to do the beach thing and you figure it out, all power to you. But if you're asking in terms of like learning and process development, I think that's maybe where some of it falls apart. Right? So those would be the concerns I would have from a personal growth standpoint.
Would you allow this in schools, and would you allow it in universities? Chat
Uh,
GPT and AI?
so it's hard for me to talk about universities because I think for different majors, there will be different views on it. Right. So if we take journalism as an example, right, I think a lot of journalism professors who I've just had random chats with often say that they believe that that should be a human writing that, right? Like it's a human story. The human does the interviews. They can take away things from that interview and put it into their articles that maybe AI would not be able to. So I think there's a more philosophical view for certain areas that it should be a human thing versus an AI thing. Personally, for my class, because its focus is on AI, I think it's important for students to understand how to use the tools. And something that I often mention to them is that, when it comes to job replacement and a lot of the fear, I think you're more likely to be replaced by someone who knows how to use AI rather than by AI itself. Okay, so in my class, I encourage them to use the tools because I don't want them to be on the wrong side of that line. Because I really believe that for them, if they can use AI tools, then I think in the workforce they become more efficient, more powerful, better users of the tool. So I'm a big proponent of students being able to use it, but I can understand why different majors or different areas might have different views on it, and I can respect that for sure.
Do you think, Kevin, there is a chance, right, that people will just become lazy and ignorant if I mean, the trend is that if you don't have to know how to multiply something or whatever, and you're just using these tools for everything, right? Is it going to make us more lazy? Or
Yeah. So I think if I look at history, right, history tends to rhyme, not necessarily repeat, right? So I'm just kind of looking at what I've seen in students in the past. And my general sense is if you give them something that makes them more efficient, they will probably take it, right? And they may not be fully aware of the consequences, right? So if I think about whether a calculator has been a good thing for human society, my sense is probably yes, right? Because if I ask myself, if I'm in a classroom, do I want to learn whether 3 times 3 is 9? Or do I want to learn about how to apply multiplication to an interesting problem? Personally, for me, I find the second one more interesting, right? So I would prefer to do that. Again, I think different people might have different preferences, but my preference would be to apply this knowledge somewhere. I think would be more interesting for me. So I would lean on that side of the equation. Just again, personal preference. I think for maybe to think about the laziness aspect of it as well, or maybe not laziness, but more related skills aspect. One of the interesting areas of research is if people or students don't learn something, does it affect other areas of their brain? Right? Because a brain is an interconnected network. It's not just like you don't memorize, so this part shuts off and everything else is okay. I think there's a lot of thought that these pieces are all related. So if we take another related example, not necessarily calculator, but let's take handwriting, right? So nowadays, a lot of kids are saying, hey, you know what? If I use speech to text or some of these AI tools, I don't need to learn how to handwrite. And I can understand that. Like when I was a kid, my teachers would get me to practice handwriting a lot so that it's okay. And I think the interesting part is if you don't learn how to handwrite, does that then have impacts on other creative areas of your brain? And I think right now we just don't have the research to be able to understand those answers. And what may happen is kids might stop learning to handwrite, and then all of a sudden we see that their painting skills drop. I'm just making it up, but those are the correlations that we don't know yet, right? So I'm with you on the laziness part, and I think to a certain extent, some laziness is probably good in terms of becoming more efficient at other things. But the one piece that we don't know about enough is if we stop learning certain things, does that affect other areas of our brain? And that's a bit where I feel like we need more research to answer those questions in a better way.
Good, great answer. Okay, so future of AI. Can you talk about what's going to happen a couple of years from now, and how do you see things changing?
Sure. So I think if I draw on my experience of working in AI, the one thing I've learned to not to do is predict AI in the future. Right. I think part of that is because of the exponential growth, and part of that is also just in terms of the pure speed at which things are happening. It's very hard to make predictions. Okay. But that being said, I think if I look at very near term, I think some of the uh, things that are going to impact AI development in the future, I think are interesting to talk about. So I think one of them is regulation, right? And I think this is an area where a lot of places around the world are trying to figure out what is a regulatory approach. And I think based on their approach, we may then start to see different types of AI develop different at different rates and also in different places as well. So if we just look at the EU, right, as an example, like the EU has recently been putting in a lot of regulations in place, and we can argue whether or not that's good or bad. I think it's a separate debate. But when I talk to a lot of companies and when we discuss a regulatory environment, some of them are saying, hey, because of the more constrained regulatory environment in the EU, I'm thinking about moving my AI development elsewhere, right? And again, it's not because they think the EU is bad, but I think they're worried about liability and potentially getting into trouble, for that. Right. So I think the regulatory piece is something where we've not seen it kind of happen in every place around the world yet. And I think based on how that does unfold, we might see some impacts in terms of the future of AI there. So I think that's one area to keep your eye on. I think that'll be quite interesting. Probably another area of AI that I'm just seeing a lot more interest in recently is the idea of AI agents, right? So when we talk about agents, AGENTS, so the idea with agents would be that you would ask it to do certain tasks, and these could be more complicated than the current, like ChatGPT, write me an email, right? It could be something like build me an app or build me a website. And when the agent is going away and doing it, so with some of the recent agents that I've seen, you can actually see kind of what's happening in the background. So let's say, for example, right, that we ask our agent to create a map of the world and use colors to indicate population density. I'm just making it up. So color-coded heat map of the world, right? So when the agent goes away and does it, it will first say, hey, I'm first going to Wikipedia to find a map, and here's what I found. I'm going to use this picture. And then you see sort of the working steps it's doing. And the cool part with some of the agents that are out there is if you don't like the map it's picked, you can say, hey, don't use this one, use something else. So then it says, okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going to go pick another world map, and then I'm going to go through the process. And then it says, hey, when I'm doing the population density, I'm going to use red as high density, blue as low density to make the heat map. And at that point, you can say, hey, actually use green for the high density population areas and use gray for the low population. So, even as the agent is doing the work for you, it's almost like you're peering over the shoulder, right? And you're making the tweaks kind of as things are happening. And I think that to me is a very exciting area. Like if you want a more maybe an example where people can relate to the a bit better, think of the Iron Man movies, right? And in Iron Man, you've got Jarvis, which is that little voice kind of talking to him, kind of in the suit. And if you ask me honestly, right, when I watched that movie and I'm seeing Jarvis, I feel like Jarvis is doing like 99% of the work, right? Like Iron Man's just kind of the guy in the suit, but he's not doing any of the calculations or firing any of the weapons. It's like Jarvis is doing all of the stuff for him. Right? So in some ways, I actually think the agents are going to probably do a lot of that stuff for us, whereas we're going to be the human oversight and we're going to be providing our input and our tweaks. And I think that's super interesting for me. Right? So I think a lot of people are talking about agentic workflows, but the idea simply means that we have an agent to do stuff for us. And then, where does a human make an impact? Where does a human kind of tweak? What is the input we provide? And I think that's going to be really interesting. So I'm very excited to see kind of what's coming on the agent side because it's a new area. And I think the potential for that is actually pretty cool.
Great. Last question for you, right? Students, how should they, the ones graduating now, right? How should they prepare for a future with AI in it?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first step is to get familiar with the tools that are out there, right? So ChatGPT, large language models, there's so many tools that are out there. So I'd say the first thing is just get your hands dirty, right? Go try this stuff out. If you're worried about the output, do it at the privacy of your own home so you don't embarrass yourself if that's a concern. But my general sense is just try the tools. Okay, I think that's the best way to learn. It's kind of like saying, hey, I can teach you driving by giving you an instruction manual, or I can put you in the front seat, and you might run over a couple of squirrels and hit a tree, but eventually you learn better, right? So I think the first step is play with the tools. I think that's really important. I think for me, the second piece, though, is for students specifically, they're often thinking about different areas of interest for them. So let's say, some kids might be thinking about finance, other kids might be thinking about healthcare. And I think for the different industries that are out there, we're going to start to see specialized tools on the AI side. Because I think the AI that doctors use and the AI that finance people use is going to be very different, right? So my second kind of piece of advice for students is get familiar with the tools in your industry, right? Because I think it's going to be very hard for one person to be able to do all the tools in every industry. It's increasing at such a high pace that that's just not, I think, fathomable going forward. So get familiar with the tools that are in your industry and start using them, right? I think if you start to do that, then you as the new person in the firm, I think add some real value because the people in the firm who are already there may not have seen the new tools, may not have invested the time to learn about it, whereas you come in with this kind of differential knowledge that a lot of other people won't have, and you might be then able to spread that knowledge to help the organization overall. But I think the main point is you come in with something really different that's really valuable, right? So I think, two of the biggest things is play with the tools and get familiar with it. And probably the last one I would say is appreciate the fact that a lot of what AI is bad at tends to be in the category of human to human interaction. So we started this discussion, Vince, at the beginning by talking a bit about soft skills, right? And I think for a lot of students, they may not appreciate the value of soft skills off the bat. But I think going forward, if we think about how jobs are going to evolve, my general sense is we will see a lot of jobs where the AI comes in, takes away the easy to automate tasks, leaving the human being with the hard to automate stuff. And I think a lot of that will be on the soft skill side. So if students get better at soft skills, I think as jobs evolve, they will still be pretty relevant for those jobs. And I think that's quite important. I think one of the other impacts we're going to see on jobs, which is related for students, is I think also a lot of students graduating today will probably do jobs that never existed before. I'm actually really excited for them because of that, because I think a lot of the boring stuff that you and me probably did back in the day will no longer exist, right? So I think that's great for them. But I think the question I often get is, okay, but how do we prepare for a job that we don't even know is going to exist in the future? And I think the way that I look at that is that whatever that new job is, it will have or require human beings to be good at things that AI is bad at, right? Because otherwise AI would be doing that job, right? So again, the soft skill bucket, those pieces that are there, I think will be relevant for job evolution and also new job creation in the future too. Right. So that's the bit I think for students that they should keep in mind. And if there was one more thing that I would add for students, it's also that I think whatever tools you use today, 5 years from now, I think those tools will probably become close to obsolete. Right. So the other thing I'm a big proponent of is continuous learning, right? Because you may know what's going on today, you might be familiar with the tools today, but if you stop your learning at this point, I guarantee you're going to be obsolete pretty quickly, right? So the other thing I recommend to a lot of students is make sure you keep that continuous learning muscle going. And I really believe it's a muscle because if you stop learning, then I think you just kind of lose it. And that's really dangerous, right? So keep looking at the new tools out there, keep playing with the stuff. And I think if you're looking at the tools in an area that you're interested in, you're automatically going to enjoy that process anyway, right? Those rabbit holes are actually gonna be fun as opposed to you forcing yourself to look at this tool for like, half an hour where you're really not interested. So I think make that part of your personal development, right? And I think if you do that, then you hedge yourself for the new jobs, you hedge yourself for the new tools, and I think a lot of stuff comes together in a good way. So that would be my kind of main advice to students today.
Fantastic, Kevin. That was a wealth of information. Thank you. Where can our audience learn more about you?
Yeah, sure. So, happy to connect with people over LinkedIn. Kevin Pereira is the last name. I'm sure we'll put it in some of the stuff related to this video. And then also you can come find Blue Artificial Intelligence on our website. So we're at bluedigital.ai. So feel free to kind of come to our website, have a look at kind of what we do. We also provide a lot of research as well. So we produce a lot of that. So if folks are interested in looking at different areas of AI, looking at different application in different industries, we've put out a lot of sort of white papers and research on what we do. So a lot of that is there. And I would also say, if people are just curious about AI, want to learn more, have questions, feel free to reach out to me over LinkedIn. I'm always happy to have the chats, always happy to discuss further. I mean, I do this for a living and I find it really fun. So I'm always happy to continue these conversations in the future.
Kevin, thank you. That was fantastic. Loved talking to you. Learned a lot, and hopefully we can meet again face to face and do one more session later on.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it, Vince. Fantastic.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you.